Choosing the right amount of RAM is one of the most important decisions you're going to make when purchasing a new or used Mac. RAM has a direct impact on the performance, multitasking, and longevity of your computer as you use it through time. So in this video, I'm going to talk about the differences between 16, 24, and 32 gigabytes of RAM and determining which level is most appropriate for you. And at this end of this video, I'm going to be talking about an edge case that really surprised me and changes the way that I think about RAM, the unified memory architecture, and how these Macs are going to last you throughout time. One of the good things that came from Apple Intelligence is it forced Apple to bump the amount of base RAM from 8 gigabytes to 16 gigabytes. So prior to this M4 MacBook Air with 32 gigs of RAM and 2 terabytes of storage, I was using the M1 MacBook Air with 16 gigs of RAM and 1 terabyte of storage. And I can say that for 16 gigabytes of RAM is definitely going to be enough for most people who are in the market for the M4 MacBook Air. In fact, I'm going to say that ratio is around 85 to 90%. Because when I had my M1 MacBook Air, I used it for about 4.5 years. And for about half of that time, I've been using Final Cut Pro. And also in the background with 16 gigs of RAM, I was able to run about 10 or 15 Chrome tabs. So I can work on my thumbnails, so I could download B-roll from YouTube, and so I can just edit pictures and everything else that I needed to do. So 16 gigs of RAM was definitely enough. And when I was looking at the swap file usage, I really wouldn't hit the swap file, and I would be utilizing about 13 or maybe 14 gigs of RAM at the most by having all of those applications open at the same time. So there does run into the scenario once in a while that if you do not have enough RAM, you're not going to be able to export videos or complete your work or export large batches of high resolution images if you do not have enough RAM. However, as I said, having 16 gigs of RAM definitely mitigates those cases when you're actually going to be running out of RAM. And at 16 gigs of RAM, especially for students or people who are not really going to push the system, that is more than enough to get you through the next couple of years. And you shouldn't have to worry about RAM management whatsoever. 24 gigs of RAM is an interesting memory configuration because that sits right between 16 and 32. And I have very limited experience with 24 gigs of RAM. So about a year and a half ago, I picked up a 15-inch M3 base MacBook Air, and it had 512 gigabytes of storage and 24 gigabytes of RAM. So I wasn't able to really do extensive testing on that system. But what I will say, contrasting 24 to 16, I believe 24 gigabytes of RAM is appropriate for most people who want to get into content creation. Because it's 24 gigs of RAM, you can keep, say, Final Cut Pro open, or it can have Lightroom running in the background. So you might be able to have about 2 pro level applications, as well as being able to run all of your other apps in the background, and you don't have to worry about memory pressure or hitting that swap file. So I would say for the time being here in 2025, 24 gigs of RAM is going to get you quite a long way if you're starting to go into the content creation game. Now, when we go up to 32 gigabytes of RAM, which is what I have in this M4 MacBook Air, that is really actually overkill for the intended audience of the people who purchase M4 MacBook Airs. So the only way that I can think of that I would be able to exhaust 32 gigabytes of RAM is if I'm using a bunch of simulators, if I'm running emulation, if I'm running a bunch of virtual machines or Docker containers. So if you're really going to be straddling that threshold of 32 gigs of RAM, and if you're a professional, like say a professional software engineer, that is really going to start to push your system. And at that point, I'm going to advise everybody to just upgrade to, say, the MacBook Pro, because there are a lot of benefits to having that Pro machine. You can have either 36, 48, 96, 128 gigabytes of RAM. So if you really need to do a lot of heavy virtualization on that system, like say running about maybe 7 or 8 virtual machines, and if you have a lot of RAM on board, that's when I think that it's more appropriate to go to the MacBook Pro and go beyond the standard 32 gigabytes of RAM that you can get on the Air. So with the Air in this 32 gigabyte configuration, it is absolutely overkill. For what I do in my workflow and how I make these videos, there's no way in hell that I'm going to be able to exhaust 32 gigabytes of RAM anytime soon. The only time I worry about exhausting my RAM is as the features and the upgrades of the operating systems come into place, because as the operating system has more features, of course, you're going to introduce no more bloat into the system. So over time, I worry about, say, maybe about 5 or 6 years from now, is 32 gigabytes of RAM going to be as robust? Probably is not. However, I spec up my systems with as much RAM as possible because I plan on keeping these computers for at least 6 or 7 years. So that means, say, 2031 or 2032. So 32 gigabytes of RAM for people in the market for a MacBook Air who know that they're not necessarily going to push their system day in, day out, casual consumers, prosumers, people who want to do some creative content. 32 gigabytes is absolute overkill. 24 gigabytes of RAM right now seems to be that sweet spot. So if you just want to start getting into content creation, for example, 24 gigs, I believe, is the sweet spot. And finally, when it comes to the pricing to these RAM upgrades, to go from 16 to 24, you're talking about $200. And then go from 16 to 32, you're talking about $400. So as you can see, these upgrading prices from Apple is absolutely a ripoff compared to what you can get in a comparable Windows PC. However, when it talks about longevity, as I said, these higher tier RAM options are going to get you through now and into the future. Let's talk about that edge case. And I'm referring to having 8 gigabytes of RAM in 2025. So I have access to a system with 8 gigabytes of RAM, 256 gigabytes of storage, M1 processor, and this is the least powerful Apple Silicon Mac Apple has ever made. So what I decided to do is I loaded Final Cut Pro into my system. I took one of my projects that I edited on my M4 MacBook Air and I put it onto this M1. I took 17 tabs in the background, Chrome tabs. And what I was able to do is I was able to export a 10-minute project in Final Cut, as well as having those 17 tabs in the background. And what I saw when I opened up Activity Monitor is that my memory pressure only hit the yellow. And in all of my tests, I was never able to hit the red memory pressure. So if you have green memory pressure, that means you're good. You don't have to worry about anything. If you're going up into the yellow, that means you're kind of pushing your system and performance may start to degrade just a little bit. And if you have red memory pressure, that means you're basically RAM starved, and you're going to notice degradation across the system. So what I found interesting is that with all of these Chrome tabs and Final Cut exporting at the same time, I was only in the yellow memory pressure. And again, this only has 8 gigabytes of RAM. And what I also did as an interesting other test is I decided to load up Chrome with 32 tabs in the background. I didn't run Final Cut, but I figured I would use a more real world scenario. People who have 8 gigabytes of RAM, who don't really manage their memory as well as I do. So as a result, they would just leave 32 tabs open at the same time. So once again, I believe the memory pressure did go up into the yellow. However, once again, it didn't go into the red. And I was able to flip back and forth between these 32 tabs of Chrome tabs with no problem whatsoever. And I didn't notice any slowdown. So the way that Mac OS manages memory, it does a couple of things. It uses the swap file, of course, but it also compresses RAM in the background. So because of that RAM compression and the way that it also handles cache files as well, so OS 10 or Mac OS wants to use as much memory as possible. Not only will it give you application memory, but at the same time, it wants to cache as many files as possible. Now, as you start going through your day and as you start loading up more application memory, it's going to purge those cache files and hand over that memory to application memory, so you're not going to notice any slowdown. And as you continue to use your computer and as you continue to exhaust the RAM, it's going to start compressing the memory. And memory compression came back all the way from macOS 10.9 Mavericks. So they really did perfect the ability to cache and compress going back for a couple of years. So 8 gigabytes of RAM is definitely doable in 2025 as long as you don't ask too much of it. So if you want to run multiple pro level apps at the same time, so if you want to run, say, Photoshop, Illustrator, and Adobe Premiere, you can forget it. That's not going to work at all whatsoever. You're probably going to be able to crash applications at that point. But if you want to just be able to do a lot of Chrome tabs, if you're a real normal user who doesn't really expect that much out of their system, you can do perfectly fine with 8 gigabytes of RAM in 2025. Now, over time, is that going to be enough? Maybe not. Because as I said, as the operating system becomes more bloated, you're going to be exhausting that memory. So 8 gigabytes of RAM might be on its lifeline. But if you're in a pinch and you only can afford a system with 8 gigs, then by all means, you are going to be able to use that feasibly, at least now, and say maybe about a year or two into the future, until the operating system becomes more bloated. So that's just my take on having the right amount of RAM in your system, and hopefully that makes you helps you with making the best decision. All right, that's about it. Peace.